Good to see everyone here. I'm going to be building off of what was just shared in regards to China, but before that, I'm going to be speaking in regards to North Korea and then transitioning from there to China. At the end of World War II, Joseph Stalin got more involved in the Pacific theater of World War II in order to strengthen his hand at the negotiating table after the war. And that's exactly what happened. After World War II, he negotiated for half of Korea, and he got it. There were 2 US Army colonels who signed off on that, and half of Korea was given to Joseph Stalin. And he did not negotiate for half of Korea in order to be content with half of the peninsula. He wanted to, and had designs from the beginning, to swallow the entire peninsula. He put in his own plant, who had been trained in the Soviet Union, someone by the name of Kim Il-sung, who was the first supreme ruler in North Korea. And the idea from the beginning was to invade aggressively in order to reunify the peninsula by force. That's a bit of the macro picture of what was happening. And I want to zoom in now and share a story that occurred shortly before the Korean War. There were some communist infiltrators from North Korea who came across the border, the 38th parallel, and accosted a couple young boys, close in age to my youngest 2 boys. I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. They were around that age. And they were the sons of a certain pastor's son in South Korea. And these communist agents went to them and said, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ?" "Yes, we do." "You must recant your belief in Jesus or else we will kill you." The older son says, "Kill me first, I'm older." The younger one says, "No, kill me first." And both of them steadfastly refused to deny their faith in Jesus. And successively, each of them were murdered by this communist agent. This communist agent was captured, and there was a trial held. And the shocking thing was this. In the midst of this trial for the murder of his sons, Pastor's son stood up in the trial and he said, "Stop the trial. I will adopt the murder of my sons." And he did. And that communist agent himself became a Christian. And it became an inspiring example of love and of forgiveness and of redemption just before the Korean War erupted. When Kim Il-sung got the green light from Stalin, he invaded and pushed back the South Korean forces down to the southern tip of the peninsula, the Busan perimeter as it was called. My own parents were kids during that Korean War and were among the refugees who fled to the southern tip of the peninsula. But then, the US led a coalition of forces that pushed back. General Douglas MacArthur engineered a brilliant landing at Incheon, my mom's hometown, and split the communist North Korean forces in half and pushed back up. And it looked like there was a chance to regain the peninsula for the South until huge numbers of Chinese soldiers came pouring across the border. My great uncle who fought in the war, he told me that a bunch of them were given orders to obtain arms from the enemy because they were unarmed by their own military. But there were so many of them that eventually pushed back the US-led UN forces down to the original line of demarcation, the 38th parallel. What's of course ironic about the so-called demilitarized zone dividing North and South Korea to this day is that it is the most militarized border on planet Earth. And a contrast that you can see through satellite imagery at night that is really a metaphor of what has happened to a large extent on the Korean Peninsula. If you see satellite imagery at night, South Korea is lit up like a Christmas tree. North Korea is so dark that it almost seems to merge into the darkness. In a lot of ways, that's a metaphor of the way the Korean Peninsula has been and has become. If I were to try to summarize what happens in North Korea, one two-word summary of North Korea is criminal cult. Criminal cult. They commit all manner of crimes in North Korea, and maybe the biggest emblem of that are the concentration camps inside of North Korea, where think Hitler's camps, think Mao's camps, think Stalinist gulags, except worse in this regard, that they have 3 generations of those who are deemed anti-revolutionary, anti-communist revolutionary in these concentration camps. You don't even want to know the horrors of what happens in there. But it is one jail of a country. You can't even cross the street in Pyongyang without permission. And the whole society is structured around perceived political loyalty to the supreme ruler in North Korea, who is deified. The 3 Kims form an unholy triad that are supposedly deity in North Korea. The deceased first 2 are referred to as the eternal president and such, and they're all considered God. And so when I received a postcard in the mail from the North Koreans, it had a picture of Kim Jong-un on the front, looking very jolly, and it said, "It is God's will for North Korea to take over South Korea by force." Well, very convenient if God in this case means him. But this is reflective of the 3 persistent, overarching goals that the North Koreans have had, and it is to promote positive sentiment towards North Korea and South Korea, and you may have a hard time believing how much they've succeeded in that, especially with respect to the middle-aged and younger generations in South Korea, to get the US uncommitted to defending South Korea, and I'm going to touch a bit more on this in regards to current legislative proposals in the US. And then finally, and this is the end game for them, is to take over the peninsula by force. And in trying to do this, they follow a normal cycle where they precipitate a crisis, get to the table who they want, negotiate benefits, swallow those benefits, break the agreement, rinse and repeat, and you see this time and time again. This is the standard modus operandi of the communist government in North Korea. One of the pieces of legislation that North Korean operatives and their abettors are pushing in Congress right now is to try to get a declaration of the end of the Korean War. This sounds innocuous. It sounds like maybe a good thing, and they want to attach it together with the whole concern of reuniting families that were divided by the Korean War so that Korean Americans can be reunited with their loved ones. And so that's the way they're trying to get this through. Let me tell you the problem here. This is related to their objective to get the US uncommitted to defending South Korea. The biggest deterrent to another full-blown Korean War is the fact that the US has provided a strong military deterrent to keep that from happening. If there's a declaration of peace that the Korean War has ended, then it would be very tempting, and indeed maybe the plan, for the South Korean leftist government to declare US forces to be not necessary anymore on the Korean Peninsula. for the US deterrent to then be removed, which is the biggest invitation for another full-scale war on the Korean Peninsula, objective number 3, the final endgame objective of North Korea. Do you see how devious this is? In the name of peace, they would create a greater danger of war by virtue of potentially removing the UN command led by the United States of America, which has been the biggest deterrent preventing another full-scale Korean War. And when you have the 4 largest militaries in the world involved, the US, China, Russia, and North Korea. Did you know North Korea was number 4? When you have the 4 largest militaries in the world that could be involved, a conflagration on the Korean Peninsula could potentially expand into a World War III. The stakes are very high, but they're trying to say, let's have peace. This would be worthy of the supposed peace that was brokered by a certain Neville Chamberlain with a certain Adolf Hitler before the start of the Second World War. China has been keeping North Korea in place. Most of the so-called trade, of the economic intercourse that North Korea has is with China, over 90%. Much of it is more descriptive as aid rather than trade. They have various different projects. As was mentioned before, rare earth minerals are a major goal of China, and North Korea has an abundant supply of rare earth minerals. They also rather like having North Korea to poke the United States in the eye and to be a big headache to the United States of America. That works pretty well for the Chinese Communist Party. There are many points of leverage that exist between the US and China. Guess who the largest export market for China is? You can get a lot of cheap things over at Walmart, thanks to China. The United States of America is the biggest export market by a sizable margin. Guess who the biggest foreign holder of US debt is in the world?
Japan.
China again. Guess who's stealing our intellectual property? Because they don't believe in intellectual property, so they say. Again, China. You have many, many different points of potential influence and impact that China has over the US, but that the US also has over China, which is why in the last administration there was 4-dimensional chess being fought. When I was in the US State Department, there were many, many lines of effort relating to China. I remember when Secretary Pompeo convened the Chief of Mission Conference, which is for all the ambassadors of the United States worldwide, convening in DC. And the biggest overriding theme and topic of that conference was the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to the United States of America. They have explicitly, publicly said that they are in a century-long great power struggle with the United States of America. They would like to displace the United States as the lone superpower of the world and assume that hegemonic status over the world. And it's not just North Korea. When I was in the State Department, my office was doing various things in regards to Sri Lanka, for example. We got a public visa sanction that happened against the head of the army in Sri Lanka, who had been involved in the perpetration of war crimes during the 26-year Sri Lankan Civil War. We had over 1 terabyte worth of evidence with respect to this. This was called by my presidentially appointed Senate confirmed predecessor as the biggest success for justice in the history of Sri Lanka. But to give you an idea of the Chinese influence, along the lines of what was mentioned before, they gave these toxic loans in regards to a port that was built up, the Hambantota port, that Sri Lanka was not able to pay back, which the CCP then foreclosed upon, and it gave them their first port along the Indian Ocean, along which a large percentage of cartoned merchandise travels in the world. And Sri Lanka continues to accept all sorts of toxic loans. And at the same time, Sri Lanka rejected an outright gift from the Millennium Challenge Corporation of the United States of America in favor of these toxic loans from China, even after experiencing what they experienced in regards to the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. It relates also more recently to what happened in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a major source of lithium, which is used for batteries that power things like electric cars. The current administration has turned the entire US fleet of vehicles into electric vehicles. Guess who the leading producer of these lithium batteries is in the world? China.
Lithium triangle.
Guess whose embassy was the only one that was left in Afghanistan in the wake of what happened? The Chinese embassy. Guess who was able to obtain all sorts of military wear that was left behind in Afghanistan, billions of dollars, huge amounts of military wear in Afghanistan. Not just the Taliban, but also China. Afghanistan not only has rich stores of lithium, it has all sorts of rare earth minerals as well. And this all was handed on a golden platter, not only to the Taliban, but also to the Chinese Communist Party. Something that I worked on for most of my time during the ambassadorship were the mass atrocity determinations against the Chinese Communist Party for genocide and crimes against humanity for what they are perpetrating against Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities in Xinjiang province. I've never worked on something where I've gotten hit in more directions than this task. And we produced a pile of documents as the Chief Policy Office driving this initiative that got to Secretary Pompeo, who on January 19th moved forward with these atrocity determinations for genocide and for crimes against humanity that the Chinese Communist Party is perpetrating in Xinjiang province. When I was interviewed that day by media sources such as the Washington Post and New York Times, one of the things I said was that this is typical of communist regimes. They typically crush their people. That is the norm of what happens in communist regimes. I said other choice things along those lines, and you will find not one word quoted of everything I said to these media sources. They published none of it.
Wow.
Even as they wanted to dismiss this as Pompeo's parting shot or things along these lines. It was covered by media worldwide and is continued to reverberate in various ways. The Five Eyes, the closest intelligence allies of the United States, have levied sanctions. The European Union has levied sanctions in the wake of this. There have been a whole raft of sanctions by the US government in this regard as well. A good portion of the content of the world comes from Xinjiang. And there is talk about potentially boycotting the Beijing Olympics that are coming up. There have been a whole series of reverberations and ongoing impacts as we were able to lay down that marker that the publication First Things said was the most important human rights achievement of the prior 4 years. And every bit of it, in spite of the difficulty in doing so, was worth it when you consider the mass atrocity crimes going on against these innocent people in Xinjiang province, where they're incarcerated, where they are propagandized, where they are enslaved, where there are all sorts of crimes, torture, sexual crimes, all sorts of things being committed, forced abortion, forced sterilization. There is a whole array, and we had a huge amount of evidence with respect to this, even evidence from Chinese Communist Party documents themselves that were indicative of what is going on. But it's not just Xinjiang, it's Tibet, that was mentioned before. It's the abuses against the Falun Gong. It's the persecution against Christians. It's a whole range of things. Did you know that the Chinese Communist Party has been changing the Bible, and the Quran for that matter too, to conform with Chinese Communist Party doctrine? They've expelled a bunch of missionaries. And they have risen after not being among the top persecutors of Christians in the world. They have risen back into the top 20 in the world, joining North Korea, which is number one every study, every year. It doesn't matter which one you pick. This is a major issue that is being dealt with. Hong Kong has fallen to a large extent. There are major military assets being amassed by this government in China against Taiwan. And there are all sorts of ways that we have some major threats from China. When Secretary Pompeo decided to shut down the Chinese consulate in Houston, it was because the whole consulate basically was a spy ring, spying on the United States of America. A lot of people don't realize the magnitude of the threat, the magnitude of the challenges that are there, and the more the influence, whether it's the influence they have with Facebook or all sorts of politicians or what have you, the less that is recognized, the more they're able to sow chaos and infighting here in the United States. The more they can weaken us, the more they can get away with their malfeasances that they are perpetrating literally all over the world. This is real. This is not some conspiracy theory that is there. There is ample evidence to back this up. Even I invite you to look at the open source evidence that's there. Of course, I'm not going to talk about the classified evidence, but even if you look at the open source evidence that's there, you will be able to confirm the things that are being shared. This is a grand challenge, potentially an existential challenge that we face as a country for the next short term, next dozen of years, but also into the half century and century. This could be one of the defining struggles of our time. Thank you for your attention.